Well, hi everyone, and thanks for joining us for the MIL URL talks. First, let me introduce myself. My name is Elise, and I'm the project coordinator of Liveurope, which is an EU-funded platform of 16 concert venues in Europe, whose aim is to promote emerging European artists. And I'm very happy to have been invited by the team of MIL to moderate this virtual discussion on why we need to measure the value of live music spaces in cities. It's a topic that has gained a new acquired importance with the current crisis. Live music spaces were the first ones to close due to the current pandemic, and will certainly be the last ones to open again, where they're not simply threatened to close. So it appears that it will take years for them to recover, and thus impacting their whole role in forging the lives of cities. Through revenues and the jobs they represent, the social cohesion they foster, and their role in supporting artists, federating creative communities, and developing the larger music ecosystem. But to what extent can we measure their impact, and how can we probably assess their value to build a case for venues among decision makers? If we often compare the economic weight of the automotive industry and the weight of the cultural industry, where does the live music sector stand? So around Europe and beyond, a various set of organizations took it upon themselves to carry out this mission of measuring the value of live music spaces in cities. And today, we're lucky to be among some of their representatives to discuss these challenges. So around our virtual table today, we have Simon. So Simon, you're a data analyst at the Music Venues Trust that acts to protect, secure, and improve grassroots music venues in the UK. And in the wake of the crisis, the Music Venues Trust launched the Save Our Venues campaign to raise fundings for venues threatening to close, but we'll get to that later. We also have Arne here. Arne, who is an all-around expert on festivals and venues. Among other things, you've worked for VNPF, which is the Dutch Music Venues Association, and you're in charge of data collection for LiveDMA, the European Association of Live Music Venues and Festivals. We also have Renata here. Renata, you're a data analyst at DataSim, which is the research center on the music market in Brazil. And DataSim was actually launched by SIM São Paulo, which is one of the most important music conventions in Latin America. And last but not least, we have Lutz here. Lutz, you're a spokesman of VibeLab, which advocates for the rights of Berlin's cultural life. And together with the former Night Mayor of Amsterdam, you launched Creative Footprint, a project to measure, compare, and advocate for creative spaces in cities like Berlin, New York, and Tokyo, I believe. So yeah, we have a very varied set of data specialists here in the live music sector who will provide us their expert eye on the topic that we will be discussing today. So yeah, with no further ado, I suggest we start to delve in the conversation with them first before we open the floor for questions from the audience at the end. So yes, first, let's start with Arne. So Arne, you've been pretty much a pioneer in data collection. So for 7 years, you've been collecting data, facts, and figures on the European music venues with LiveDMA. So maybe my first question for you would be, what has been the added value of your work in the past 7 years, and why do you think data analysis for live music spaces is essential, especially in times of crisis like this?
LiveDMA consists of 20 different associations within Europe. So it's venue and festival associations all over Europe. And some countries were already quite experienced a long time with data collection. For example, in Switzerland and in Belgium and in France and in the Netherlands, they already collect data of all the venues for the past 10 to 15 years. But there's also a lot of regions where they didn't have any data collection yet. In the Scandinavian countries, for example, or in the UK, or in Germany, or in Spain. So what I do with LiveDMA is helping structuring data collection into their associations, make sure they start collecting data, they analyze it in the right way, and then most importantly, use it in the right way, because it's key for representation of your music venues, but also to start up dialogues with governments and politicians. We learned in the last years that, for example, politicians won't really listen to you if you don't back things up with statistics. And you can see the effects right away. Like, for example, in Spain, they started 3 years ago to develop a better survey. And now they really have a dialogue with the government and other institutions. So it can help venues on a local level in their city to show who they are, their artistic importance, for example, their social importance, how many jobs it creates, but also the economic value. But it works also on a regional level, on a national level, and for LiveDMA, even on a European level. So the data are basically key to show who you are and to represent yourself as the live music sector.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Great, thanks, Arne. And I'm actually jumping to make a connection between you and one of the speakers here, because LiveDMA is, as you mentioned, a members organization that gathers national music venues associations, and the Music Venues Trust is one of them, represented by Simon here. So Simon, actually, for how long have you been analyzing data for the Music Venues Trust, and how does it contribute to serve the purpose of your organization?
I joined the Music Venue Trust. Well, I'm not employed directly by them. I just do work for them. But it's been, I think, 4 years now. The first year, it was really, I was involved in mapping where venues were and where they used to be. We started with basically that data, what used to be there 10 years ago and what's left now, and where did they all go and why can be answered by collecting more data and looking at how hard it is to keep going as a small venue, which, as you said, is the Music Venue Trust's focus is basically under 500 cap. So we are looking at the smallest venues you've got, and then their particular struggles are quite different. Using the survey that that LiveDMA do, and some of our own extra questions on top of that, we are able to see what works and what doesn't, and to share that information with the members. When I started out, there weren't very many members, but it's grown massively, and in the last year or so, it's huge. It's almost half as big again as it was a year ago. It's gaining ground because they all need help and they all want help, and the best way of helping them is to get them talking to each other, because they've all got different ideas and they've all got something that really worked. And I'm not saying that thing would work everywhere, but it's been very useful in finding out things like charitable status. That was something that there were very few of to start with, and there's now almost nobody who hasn't adopted that. It's been very useful to find, and there's so many different levels of that. Collating the data has been how we found out all of this stuff.
So collecting data, in your case, you find that it helps also for structuring and giving a better visibility to the music venues on how they work, what is effective, that's also a nice perspective, which is not just in the support for dialogue with decision makers, but also support for the sector in general. Actually, now let's move from the UK a little bit to more in the east of Europe, with Berlin, with you, Lutz. So you co-founded Creative Footprint when you were an executive board member with the Berlin Club Commission. I think you still are. How did you create Creative Footprint, and how does it inform your work to protect the cultural rights in Berlin?
Well, when we lobbied for Berlin's music venues in the Chamber of Commerce, sitting right next to the real estate developers. For us, it was essential to have more data and to be better prepared than we were in that time, because we made a lot of effort into creating emotions in protests and into pointing out that venues are closing, but we couldn't really make a case that that the venues are not just moving around, that they really disappear. Because there's always this narrative, oh yeah, they will find somewhere the next spot, and you know, this kind of caravan which is moving through the city from one district to another. And for us, it was important to create a methodology that everybody understands, because they maybe use a similar methodology already. And so we came onto the idea of creating something like the carbon footprint for creative space. Because if you chop down 3 trees, everybody knows today that you have to plant them somewhere else to keep it in a balance in a city. And so our way of presenting the data to real estate developers, to city officials, was to present this idea of a creative footprint, which was for quite a long time just an idea by myself. And then at the one conference, I met the Harvard professor, and he said, "This is a brilliant idea. We need to put some resources on that." And now with the collaboration between Harvard, the University of Pennsylvania, and VibeLab, and we did a study in Berlin once, and then we did it in New York, and this year we actually present the data from Tokyo, which is going to be also very interesting to look at. I have also some slides, but maybe I can show some of the insights later on. But it really helped in many ways. We developed some projects out of that data. In every city, something developed with that information. In Berlin, for instance, we created a tool which is called Club Radar, where we now see the information coming in from all the developments which are happening in the city, from city data. And we basically have a traffic light system that when there's like a new development too close to a music venue, that we get kind of a red light warning sign and email alerts. So we actually see what is happening all over the city, and it's always matched with new developments. So this is all based on that data that we created once by the Creative Footprint. And we also want to monitor the changes. So we also see what's happening. Are the venues getting more commercialized? Are they getting pushed out of the city? Like all these, are they maybe less interesting for the community? So these are all the soft factors which we are also measuring. And right now in New York, we're doing a project with the NYU students to measure the nighttime traffic in Corona times and after Corona, hopefully soon. So we can also see movements around venues which are right now not happening and maybe in the future. So to also develop a more sustainable nighttime with that information that we gathered.
Yeah, it's quite interesting to see that this methodology you developed for Berlin can actually be applied to other cities, and actually I think it also was one of the inspiration that DataSim took when they created their first surveys and their first studies. Actually, Renata, I read that you did take inspiration from Creative Footprint, but also the Music Venues Trust when you elaborated your survey. Can you tell us a little bit about the genesis of DataSim, and why did you decide to launch it?
It was a great inspiration, and it's very good to meet you in person, almost in person now. The man himself. It was an inspiration, but in our case, specifically in Brazil, we needed to go a little bit further because we never had a data-driven project, or when it comes to music, especially in this recent years, because of all changes in politics, we had many problems and struggles to point out the importance of the cultural sector. So our methodology, it's a bit different. We have many more questions, but focusing our challenges here in Brazil. And we've been dealing with data since day one of São Paulo. We are a Semana Internacional da Música, Music International Week. We've been working in the market for 7 years. Our event is a 7-year-old event. And since the day one, we've been dealing with the numbers, as our friend said. You have to impact the brands, the sponsors, talk to the public and private sector. So then it came the necessity to organize this value, this amount of data in order to empower our community. We are an event that brings some kind of information, some kind of knowledge, and data is part of that. Data is a powerful tool to improve all the dialogues, good and bad dialogues with different sectors. So we born from this necessity to empower even more our community. We have been developing different research, one focused in the venues, as you point out, other one in partnership with Berkeley, to study the women participation or the lack of women participation in music industry. And now we just finished this study about the impacts of COVID in our market in Brazil.
Great. Yeah, I think we'll get the chance to delve into that a little bit more later. But thank you, Renata. Very inspiring words. So yes, data can be a powerful tool. And actually, in looking at the various studies you've developed using this powerful tool, we can also be very struck by the multiplicity of findings and the diversity of the results you've achieved. This is something you've already mentioned a little bit, but I think we can take a bit of time to look into that. So, for example, Lutz, so one of the core philosophies of the creative footprint is to show the spillover effects of live music spaces. From what I understand, it's really to show that music is one core activity, but it also generates other related economic and social activities. So, yeah, how does that really translate into your findings? And is there specific findings that you want to highlight here?
We think that that you have to focus on the art form that is most impactful and also drives innovation. So we focus on music as our core, but we also look how is the music related to visual arts, performing arts, and literature. It was very important for us to look at more on the cultural side than on the commercial side of venues, because the more they're cultural, the less they are able to finance venues in some areas of the city. This is basically the set of data parameters that we are aggregating. So we do an online research, so secondary data on the space. So we look at how big is the space, what's the reputation of that space in social media, so how much impact does it has on different platforms. We look at how long it is operating, and how much frequency is around that space when it comes to traffic and accessibility to traffic. And then we also look at what you just mentioned, the design of the space, so how multifunctional it is. Then we have focus group meetups. In New York, for instance, we did 6 focus group meetups with about 200 participants. It's part of the research that we involve the community in a very early stage, because we want to also arm them with data that they can advocate. And the more they're involved also in the aggregating of the data, we see that that they are really using that methodology also in their daily work. So at the content side, we look about how interdisciplinary those spaces are being used. One important factor is also how does this space advertises to to the public? Does it advertise with cheap alcohol, let's say, or with an artistic program? So it's a curated venue or not? Then we also look at how much is it focused on a certain community, on a marginalized group, etc. And also how the output of the creative work is it in original works usually, or is it just top 40 hits being played? And then also how much experimental that space is on a local benchmark. And then finally, we look at the framework conditions. How is the funding availability? How is the public transport after midnight? How is the policies on overall regulation? The accessibility to politicians, for instance, club commissions, night mayors. Is there a position created like that? And then last but not least, how possible is it for these like small grassroots movements to use public space for their work? So that's basically what the set of content is. And then we gather about 25,000 data items and then crunch it down. And in Berlin, we then for all the cities, we have a index created. So it's always a number out of 10. And you can see that Berlin is 8.02 out of 10. Based on about 500 music venues. And we also map venues, but we also look that we don't map individual venues because some of them are not totally legal. So we also want to protect them. So we always kind of blur it and don't show them exactly. And then you can see some of the impressions of our meetups. New York has an index of 7.29 out of 10, and also based on almost 500 music venues. Here you can also see that most of the venues are still in Manhattan, some of them in Brooklyn, and then in the outer skirts towards Queens and the Bronx. And also here, some of our impressions of our focus groups. And then finally, Tokyo, which is just being published in the next days, has an index of 6.51 out of 10. And is also based on about 700 music venues. And you can also see that here in Shibuya are most of the venues. But every city has their very individual takeouts and analysis. And you can see, for instance, that in the character of these different sizes in the cities, you can see that in New York you have. I just have to. I don't see my whole screen right now, but you can see that you see that in Tokyo, for instance, there are a lot of very small venues in the city compared to New York, for instance, where you have a lot of large venues still, and in Berlin they're more like medium sized. We see also that most of the venues, compared to the highest district density, you see that Shibuya has the most amount of venues, and then followed by Friedrichshain-Kreuzberg in Berlin, and then Manhattan somewhere at the end. So these are like comparables which are interesting to see, and I'm happy to share this with everyone, just to give you a quick insight into our research.
Great. Well, thank you very much for this very comprehensive look on your work. Actually, this also echoes in me the similarities that there can be between Renata's work at DataSim and at Creative Footprints. Now, Renata, you said that you took it as an inspiration, but you didn't develop it in the same way. Can you tell us a little bit more about your findings and how you've worked?
The first interesting finding we found, it was the resistance of people in Brazil have to share their own data. It was amazing the effort that we had to do in the first place to educate them and show them it is important to share with us, because this is going to be a very powerful tool for any kind of uses you may want in order to promote your venue, promote the city, promote the nightlife. And first of all, it was very difficult. We mapped the total venues in São Paulo. Then we choose 300 as the most expressive ones, and then we were able to talk with 86 venues. And the thing that intrigued us most, it was how the survey helped them to improve their work. It may sound pretentious, this is not the intention, but there were a lot of questions that we thought that the audience, let's put it this way, it would be prepared to deal with. But it was amazing to see them asking and informing and learning from what they do in real life, without thinking systematically about it, and to think about it and to improve their own spaces for it. And this made such a strong impact because they felt that the results, it was the community results. And we saw people talking about and the importance of that. And when we had all data gathered, not only we had effort to share this and media and everything, but many people were everywhere carrying our studio and talking to their sponsors, to their communities, to use this knowledge that the survey provided them. We are very gender questioning oriented, so we had some questions to know more about how women are participating in these venues. Are they leaders or only operational systems? How these venues made to curate their content, the finance, the money-wise thing. There were many similarities, but we had to interview with much more questions online in order to gather the data that we needed, because we didn't have the chance to have this focus groups with them. So difference are more, and we did not create an index, but we gathered the data, and the most important thing for us, it was the impact that we created to them in terms of learning how to use the data.
Very interesting. And actually, well, the what you mentioned about the impact on how to use the data is, I think, a really powerful way in how to valorize the live music spaces in cities. And it actually just echoes to me in one of the major trends that has been happening, especially in the UK, is that a lot of venues have been closing over the past year, even more than it used to be before. And this is definitely something you've been monitoring a lot, Simon, at the Music Venues Trust. Can you tell us a little bit more about that and other findings you've been making with Music Venues Trust?
Last year was the first year that we managed to have, I think, the same number at the end of the year that we had at the beginning. It wasn't the same venues, but it was the same number of venues. But yeah, exactly. It seems odd to call it a victory, but it is. It's the first year it didn't decline. That was what, in the first year, we knew that over a decade, it was over 35% of venues in London alone had just gone. The first question is why? And some of them it was inevitable. It was developments. It was things that couldn't be stopped easily. But the more questions you ask, the more you find out it's not always they couldn't be saved. Some of them it's possible to save them with a bit of effort. Some of them recently it's been a remarkably small effort. There have been sort of small sums of money that they just can't afford to pay for something that sometimes it's a legal representation. So, you know, the system we have here is I think quite different. In terms of the government's involvement in small music venues, there virtually isn't any. Other than issuing a liquor license or not, that's about it. There are no grants, there's no support mechanism at all. It's every man for himself. And so if you are struggling to keep your venue going and then you get an unexpected noise complaint and you need a legal team to answer that, where do you get the money? Or do you just say, okay, can't afford it, we'll shut? And that's what was happening to a lot of them. There's been a lot of redevelopment of office buildings or former office buildings into residential. And as soon as you put a building that was only occupied during daylight hours is suddenly occupied, if you quite often outside of daylight hours, because the people who bought the buildings had office jobs, so they weren't there during the day, but they came home at night and there was this noisy thing just next to them. And that has probably been the biggest single problem. Is you build a flat next to a venue and there are noise complaints, and dealing with that has been one of the major things that the music venue has done, and it succeeded. We actually, you know, we did lobby the government, and there is the agent of change principle has been accepted, and that was enormous. It made such a difference. I don't know if anyone knows what the agent of change principle is, but it's basically, if you're making the change, you're responsible for the problems that change causes. Therefore, if you build residence next to a noisy venue, you've created the problem of having an annoying neighbour. Your annoying neighbour was there all along. It just wasn't annoying you before. And it isn't a good enough reason to shut the thing down. It just isn't. But nobody for years had stopped and thought about it, and it's made a huge difference. But there are now, of course, other challenges, and so as soon as you start asking people, well, what else causes problems, you open up the field to anything and everything. And the data that we collect is very useful in that you can apply solutions that you've used in one place in another place. And so we need to keep track of where we've been successful, and in cases where we haven't, why we weren't. And I've always thought that data is, to be honest, I don't know, 10, 15, 20 years ago when I started messing around with bits of data, I realized that data is key to everything. There is, if you harvest it, there is presentable data that will answer almost any question you've got about almost anything. And I was working in a music library where we were keeping data of the music we had. And obviously it's key that data is correct, because you don't want to look up a song, play it, and then find out it's not that at all. And that principle can be applied across the board. You have to have accurate data. And if you don't have accurate data, you might as well not have data. So the more you can get and the more accurate you can get, the more you've got a way to present a valid argument. And as has been said, the only way to talk really with the decision makers is to make it financial, is to say we've created this many jobs, or if you let this place shut, you lose this much in the local economy. And that's where these surveys really work. You can put a price on it. You can put a price on it in human terms and say, this is how many jobs will go, or this is how many people won't have anywhere to go out at night. And definitely acknowledging that a right to go out at night is actually pretty good. It's a useful thing. Especially again, one of the things I think that the crisis is changing is the view of how much mental health matters. Everyone kind of said it did, but I'm not sure how many people honestly believed it until you find yourself unable to go out and unable to do. twice in the last 10 days, I've had dreams about going to a club and seeing a live band and being in a crowd. And I've never dreamt that before.
Simon, actually, we'll get to that in the last part of the conversation. But before we do that,
Elise,
just want to hear.
Can I add just one small thing?
Yeah.
There's a specific, based on that Simon said, there is a specific part of the police here in São Paulo that take care of this kind of noisy occurrences. And this part of the police is called SEAL, which is our sound for shh. And then you call the shh service to go there and to lock the place down. Shh service is the name of it.
Oh, yeah. It's very, very traumatic anecdotes. But yes, Arne, actually, well, just also to jump back on what you said, Simon, like you need to have proper data to talk to the policymakers, and like it's something we've been struggling, and we've been really trying to embrace a lot more at European level. And Arne, it's also something that you deal with on a daily basis, because obviously, like, working with data collection at the level of the continent, it's obviously quite a big work to do and to achieve, and it's also another challenge because of the diversity and the fragmentation of the way the European live music ecosystem works. And this is part of the findings you also made with the survey from Live DMA. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
First of all, it's very recognizable what Renata and Simon says, of course, because it's especially when you start and people, it's really hard for the venues when they never gave their data to an organization to get the trust to give them your data, and because you have to convince them it's in their own benefit. For example, we have a lot of there's a high diversity in Europe, especially in the way popular music is defined as an art form. It's like recognized as a performing art. You see in Scandinavia, in Belgium, Netherlands, Switzerland, countries like that, it's basically looked at the same as theater or classical music, or almost it's recognized. And there you have a very high share of subsidized venues and cultural centers. And for those venues, it's already normal to have their data because they're obliged to publish it, or they. But especially in the regions in Europe where you see there's only private commercial venues, where mostly live music is combined with like a bar restaurant function. And in that area, let's say Spain, for example, we did some workshops with venue directors, and they were not really convinced about the added value of the data collection. But I said it's crucial to start up your dialogue with the government. And then, for example, they said, but we don't want to have a relation with the government. We are private commercial. We don't even want subsidy. We don't want anything to do with the municipality. But then it was really interesting when we start working on their main challenges and problems as a venue, like the top 5 problems they had, and were all related to rules and regulations from the municipality and the government. For example, they complained about the fact that people under 18 couldn't go to concerts. They complained about municipality organizing free concerts at the square in the city. They were complaining about closing times. They had to shut down their venue at 12 instead of 2 or 3 o'clock at night, etc., etc. And then I said, yeah, but that's why their municipality is if you like it or not, it's your main partner. And that's why it's really crucial to start up this dialogue, and you need data to show them like how many concerts you do, how many visitors it attracts, how many people have a job, what's the economical value in the city. So, and that's why data collection work on all the different levels. For private venues that are not really used to this kind of work, the first level is to create awareness and recognition of your existence. But for some countries who are much further, you can get more into detail when you build up this representation. You already have this awareness and recognition. Then you can start more in detail. Look at, for example, in the Netherlands, we have a specific deal with the tax office based on our data results. or we have with author rights organizations, or with other suppliers and ministries. And so there's so much things you can get out of it. On any level it works. So I show you some this is basically what we did. We have Live DMA, it's 20 members associations in 16 countries. We represent over 3,000 music venues and festivals. It's 2,700 music venues. What we did, we collected the data. Almost 40% of all the venues in Europe replied. It was quite a high response for the first. And we extrapolated it to all the venues, so to get a view. Well, you can see it yourself. I don't have to read it out. It's very impressive. It's almost 1 million artist performances per year, live music performances. So you can see, I don't have to read it, but you can read it yourself. It has 950,000 artist performances. It's very impressive every year. It attracts 70 million people. And you can also see there's 87,000 workers involved. And you can here see how much volunteers actually are working at venues. And this is very different in different regions. For example, it's related to their legal status. For example, in Belgium or the Netherlands or Switzerland, it's really high amount of volunteers work. But for example, in the UK or Spain or Germany, it's mostly private commercial venues, and there are hardly any volunteers. It's mostly paid jobs. And also financially, it's almost 2 billion euros turnover per year. And it's also interesting what someone said before, like I think Simon said the economical value was the most important, but that's interesting about the statistics and the data, that some politicians are more sensitive to the artistic and the social value. When you want to start and you say we create about the cultural value, while other politicians more are very sensitive to employment issues and economics. So you can also change your narrative depending on the receiver, of course, and use it in your benefit. Well, I just want to show quickly the diversity. You can see here, it's important that from all the 22,700 venues, that the median capacity is 375. So you can see it's mostly small venues. We don't talk about great arenas and the big concert halls with the well-known artists. And it is also important because the small spaces are the crucial places for artists to start their career. It's the first places where where emerging talents do experience with playing live. It's the first connection with the audience, where they get their first fans, where they're it's in the UK they call it grassroots venues. I think it's a nice term. It's not used everywhere in Europe, but it's basically the place where everything starts. And sometimes we also, in our story, we try to explain that there wouldn't be any big artists playing in big stadiums or big headliners at festivals if the small venues wouldn't exist. Because every big artist has started their careers in these small venues, and it's really crucial. And therefore, it's also crucial to maintain and support the venues, of course. But yeah, you can see here the average is quite small, but also the diversity is really big between the venues. It's the same for the activities. We thought it was important to stress out that live music is not their only function. Only 1/3 of the venues have live music as their only function. But especially 1/3 of the venues also have like social educational. They have rehearsal spaces for musicians. They organize workshops to learn instruments, to learn language, to learn anything. And here, this also proves that a venue is not like simply divided between two crowds, like the creators on the stage and the audience, the consumers, but it's really mixed. There's people that get involved in culture, that organize activities, educational activities, club night. So the venues in the cities are not just like presentations organizations, but they're also really involved in involving the citizens of a city or a town to create the cultural space. And you see also a lot of multidisciplinary functions like cinema or theater. And this is one of the most important things, I think, with the diversity, is that the mix of legal status. because the private basically you could say half of the venues in Europe is private non-profit and the other half is private commercial. And we have a small part public venues, 8%. The public venues are basically the ones that are from the government itself, like financed. The employees are on the payroll of the municipality, so they get a lot of subsidy. You see here below, you see the income division of these type of legal status. And what's here important, what you can see, I put it in small under it, like the percentage of audience income, how much they are depending on the audience income. You can see public venues get a really high share of subsidy, 54%. So their share of audience income is relatively small, with 1/3. The private non-profit venues, these are the foundations and the associations. I'm from the Netherlands, from Amsterdam myself. For example, our big venues like Paradiso in Amsterdam or Melkweg, most people know them in Europe. They're all private non-profit. That means they decide what they can do. They are their own boss, but still they are non-profit, which means that all the money they make is invested back into the venue. So if they have a good year, they can invest it in creating more program, getting more emerging talents, or they can get new employees, but they don't make a profit. And you can see like 55% of their income is audience income. And then the private commercials, they're really dominant in Germany, in the UK, in Spain, in Italy. It's almost only private commercial venues. And now you can also see the damage from the lockdown. You can see it already in these numbers, because the audience income is turned to zero, which means like that the private non-profits and the public venues can still cover a lot of their fixed costs now when they close down with the subsidy. So they of course they have damage, but it's relatively less damage than the larger and the private commercial venues, who basically have no income at all anymore. And one last sheet I'd like to show, we also collect a lot about workers. I already said the volunteers work is very important. That's related to the private non-profit venues. For example, in Belgium, in Flanders, the club circuit, 90% of all the workers are volunteers. So it's really important to run the venues. But we also did research about the amount of the share of female and male workers. It's interesting. You would expect maybe a little bit less female, actually, because we all know and think the music sector is really dominated by male. But when you look deeper into it, below you see in the left you see a more detailed study about it from France, and at the right a more detailed study about it from the Netherlands. And although the 40-60 division seems like close to 50-50, you can really see in the sort of functions they do that like all the the highest remunerations are occupied by men. So the directors are like for 90% men, and the programmers, so the most money. And if you measure it in gross wages, then it's really dominated by men still. So there's a lot of work to do. But this kind of data can also help in empower gender minorities and projects, and we can measure trends and developments. So if we know these numbers now from this year, and we look at it in 5 years again, we can see trends and developments. So yeah, it gives such a rich information about all the aspects of running a venue, and the involvement of the audience, the involvement of workers, and their value, artistic value, economical value. So read this. You can it's the whole report. You can download it on our website. And now.
Great, thanks, Arne. And actually, to get back to one of the key findings that you mentioned in your presentation, and actually it goes to the next point in our conversation, is that through the data that you already have, you can already kind of measure the impact of the lockdown and the current crisis we've been having. And some of our speakers here have been also developing additional studies already to really measure the impact of the crisis. So indeed, some would say it's a bit too soon to fully grasp the magnitude of the crisis, but in a way, those few figures and findings that you've been already working on can really inform also the first measures, support measures, and relief funds that can lead the way to recovery. Actually, one really striking case among our panelists here that really is important is also the case of Simon here, because through the Music Venues Trust, you've been building an active role in measuring the impact of COVID-19 in the UK since the start of the lockdown. And you've actually already had a few support measures from the government that were unlocked thanks to your work. So yeah, can you tell us a little bit more about this?
Only a little bit, because my focus hasn't been on the impact of COVID so far. There was so much of it that a specific team was developed, if you like, to look after that. So I've stayed with working on sort of regular information and kept out of the specific stuff because there wasn't time to focus on what was really needed. Having said that, I mean, I tried to keep up with what is going on, and there were some measures put in place by the government in attempt, because we don't have any of the standard support from the government. Venues were in danger of closing so much sooner. You stop people coming in, you stop the income. It was that simple. There was nothing happening anymore. That's part of the Save Our Venues thing, was because the immediate policies that were put in place had an end date. It didn't say we will support venues until we can get past this. It literally said until, I think it was actually last week. It was like the end of May. And well, they're not reopened yet. What do they do now? There's nothing in place. So there was emergency measures needed, and the Save Our Venues campaign is what did it. And it's been very successful. But I'm loath to talk about it as a success, because it should not have been needed in the first place. You shouldn't be asking venue regulars to be... I know you need them to support your venue in a regular way, but you really shouldn't be asking for them to support your venue when they can't interact with the venue in the way that they should be able to. I think it's I'm glad it worked, and I've contributed a bit myself, but it's when so many people are financially affected by it themselves, to turn around and ask them, oh, can we have an extra bit of money because we can't open the doors, is a very difficult situation to find yourself in. It drives me crazy that the government won't get more involved than they do. But there's a whole nother conversation there that is probably best not done in front of children, to be honest.
But yeah, it's really about also what a lot of the current discussions are happening in this current crisis. That it's really not just about planning short-term recovery measures, but it's really about how we can rebuild the sustainability of our sector and how we can properly find ways to invest in it. But yeah, that's for another conversation, because we don't have time right now. But Renata, actually, in Brazil, the crisis is still very much peaking, and you said that you were developing also studies to survey COVID-19. How's it happening?
Actually, I had some data to show. Can I share the screen?
Yeah.
But
sure.
Before sharing the screen, I used to say that, by reading so many people also saying that this is not a COVID crisis. This is a humanity crisis, and the way that we take care of people, and how problematic is all the systems that we have in economical and political way, that they cannot take care of the collective, the social, the people. When we talk about venues, as our friend said, we are talking about people, families. Maybe they're not legally employed, but this is economic. This number is not only about how many people will not going to buy something new, but how many families will not have food in their table. So the main impacts that we observed in our research, we researched the music community as a whole. We had the venues here, but we decided to interview people from different segments, that this would give more numbers and more information about the whole system of the music nightlife. So one thing that we found out, that in this music sector, most of the people are micro entrepreneurs. We have a very impact of taxes in Brazil, and the problem are not the taxes. The main problems are the way that taxes doesn't bring any help for people. We have the corruption, we have the system, we have many aspects that, as Simon said, it's another discussion. But once you don't have anything back from the taxes you pay, you decided not to open a big company. You decide, I'm going to run my life as a micro entrepreneur. And the problem is that all the solutions that government offered right now, it was not designed for all kind of entrepreneurs, only the big entrepreneurs. So this is a problem for music people. And also, we found out a very low rate of associativism. There's a lack of association, and we are trying to get data so we could empower these communities to get information together and to reunite and fight for their rights, and to organize the way that they will deal with government, as our friend said before. And these are the numbers that we gather, but we are talking only about 500 companies. It was the universe that we studied. So the 500 companies that responded our survey, at that moment, it was the first week of the social distance program that the government implied. It was, they were related to 8,100 and something else events, and the audience affected, this huge amount of people that could not pay the ticket, the main income source of these venues, of these events, and the financial loss at that moment, the first week, it was that. And as our friend said, it's not still time to know what big impact will be, but we have to have sort of information gathered, organized to fight for much policies, much more government solutions to this very important part of the economic sector.
Thanks, it was very enlightening figures. Lutz, actually, the methodology you developed with Creative Footprint can still very much apply to measure the impact of this crisis. Have you been working on projects to continue using the methodology?
Yeah, well, we have the data before COVID, so it will be easy for us to measure it after COVID again. As I also mentioned, we look at the transportation right now in New York, which can be also a model to look at for other cities. Yeah, we try to develop methodologies which are transferable to other cities, so we can also compare cities to each other and also spark a bit the competition between cities. Because, if you want to be a city of the new generation of entrepreneurs, of IT specialists and engineers, you have to think about the soft factors in your city, and to be a creative city, to be a city of music, to have a vibrant nightlife is a very important factor to attract this young generation, which can work from all over the world. And I think especially after COVID, we will see that people more and more will look for the space where they can work, but also where they can have a place where the whole environment is accepting them and embracing them. And I think that is we can play a role of that with our data. Yeah.
And Arne, how have you been dealing with the crisis so far? And at the level of that live DNA, I mean, it's obviously also quite a challenge to tackle the crisis at the European level. And well, we see it's the creative sectors have been identified as a key sector to support. You might have seen that yesterday or the day before, actually, the Commission announced some support, their new recovery plan for Europe, and actually there was a decrease in the budget allocated to the creative industries. Is this something that you've been trying to measure with IVDMA?
Yes and no, because the whole Corona crisis is, I think, one of the most least coordinated things in Europe, because all the different countries have different regulations and rules and compensation measures, and so I think it's very on a regional and national level. But what we do as LiveDMA, we can really help and support the members with the methodology we have to get more out of the data. For example, the existing data that we have, it learns mostly a lot about the lost turnover. So like how much income they miss. It says also a lot about the artist's income, because we're talking about venues now, but it's also mostly the artists, of course. So the program costs for the venue, but the income for the artist, that is totally lost. So I think so I helped out all the LiveDMA members, the survey coordinators, with the methodology, how they can do an extra survey to more analyze the damage better. Because the lost turnover is very simple to collect and to calculate. But the damage that it has is more complicated, because it totally differs on, like, do you get subsidies? Do you still get subsidies? And the compensation measures. For example, there are countries like Belgium and the Netherlands that have really good compensation measures, and they pay all the personnel costs for all companies, including music venues, for 6 months. So the venues don't have any employment costs anymore, and they basically. But other countries don't have total lack of compensation measures. So what we did as LiveDMA was more like try to help out we have weekly meetings about where we talk together about the exit strategy. LiveDMA is also there mainly to exchange knowledge between different regions and venues. And COVID is a perfect way to exchange knowledge about all these topics, like what's your exit strategy? How can we do more advocacy for compensation measures? How do you analyze the data? How do you use it, etc.? So actually, it's mostly exchanging knowledge. And I think because the venues itself are not directly financed by any EU money. Yeah, maybe the Liveurope venues, of course, are one exception. But so I don't think that the European Union has that much effect in the end on the survival and existence of the venues to come out of this crisis.
Maybe actually, if there could be a way to have more funding for venues in the framework of cross-border cooperation project, that could be one solution. But that's also one of the stresses and one of the reivindications of the crisis is to allocate really proper supports for the cultural sectors, be it at local or even European level, or even national level in the case of Brazil as well. But
we noticed the crucial data here, because we talked to our government in the Netherlands, and the same is in other countries, and the analysis that we did with the corona damage data, that was crucial to get the right and more support measures. Also interesting what from Brazil, it's the same actually in Europe. Like most are freelancers. All the technicians at the venues, all the artists are micro entrepreneurs. But for example, in the Netherlands, there's also compensation measures not only for the people that are on the payroll of the venues, but also especially for the freelancers. And this is something that we stretched out also from our data, the amount of freelancers, and it helped to get more support. But one more thing, I think the main worry is the long term. Because in a lot of regions, there's enough compensation and support for short term, for like March, April, May. And now is there a sort of summer stop, like a lot of venues already closed down in the summer. But the real worry is, of course, in the fourth quarter of the year, because our data also learn us that 35% of the turnover of the money from the venues is made in the last 3 months of the year, in October, November, December. That's when all the bands are touring. That's when you have most sold out shows. Then it's
when there's the peak season indeed.
Yeah, and that's the real worry. If as long as there's social distancing until next year, they won't be able to organize activities that can break even, that make money. So even if they are slowly starting to organize concerts again in the coming months, it will be. Yeah, for most venues, you lose money if you don't sell 70 or 80% of your tickets. So you can't do any normal activities and a normal economically viable organization with social distancing. Mm-hmm. So that's really.
And that's especially when venues can be threatened to close. But I think it does highlight that there's still a lot of uncertainty linked to the crisis, but. Maybe to end on a note of positivity, it is true that, through the panel that we've just had here and through the different cooperation projects like DMA or Liveurope, there's been also a lot of exchange and solidarity in the sector. Even, in the larger live music ecosystem, we've seen a lot more dialogue between the different actors, and this is also one of the keys to help for recovery. And actually, we have a presentation that's planned. So Gonçalo Riscado is the general director of Musicbox, a venue based in Lisbon, as well as the MIL Festival, who's organizing this panel here. And both festival and the venue are very much anchored in the city of Lisbon. So now that we've really talked about the data analysis and the really methods and tools to measure the value of live music spaces in the cities, it would be interesting to get your input on how and why would you need those kind of studies for your own organization. Hello, Gonçalo.
Hi, Elise. Hello, everybody. Thanks a lot. It's been very interesting. I've been here listening to you and realizing I know some of you, and of course I know your work, and it's really so important what you're doing, and so important for Portugal. We don't have much work being done here in data collection. If we would have, someone would be here sitting representing that work in this debate. So I think it's extremely urgent, and I thought it would be useful if I could bring a practical case I'm working on now to answer, of course, the huge problem we are all living with, this global crisis. I think we have some data in Portugal around festivals, especially around and about the big festivals. Of course, they deal with a lot of money and a lot of sponsoring, and they need that data to support what they do. And of course, when this crisis emerges and is affecting everybody, and when the focus is on the cultural sector, on the music sector, the only thing we hear it's about the problem of the big festivals and the problem of the big music venues. And nobody's talking about us. And about us, I'm talking the grassroots music venues. We know we are very important, of course. We think we are. We know the work we do with the new talents, but I think it's not just with new talents. It's there's a lot of artists that depends on our circuit to exist all their lives, and that's not bad. They can sometimes play at a bigger venue, but they depends on this circuit. But nobody's talking about that, and who's the fault? I think it's our fault. First, we have to, because we have to explain how important we are, and so quite recently we managed to gather. Now we are 22 grassroots music venues from all over Portugal. Probably we are half of the grassroots music venues we think exists in Portugal. And when we start to collect some numbers so that we could show. I'm not going to do any presentation because this is so new that I don't have any presentation, but I can tell you, I can read some numbers. And it's very interesting when we can see that some venues, they have annual audience that it's the same of a big festival, of the big festivals in the country. But at the same time, they have they program maybe 4 or 5 times more artists. And then if we start to think, who are those artists? Where they come from? Of course, they are promoting local artists, and and I'm talking about just one venue. But if we could like these 22 venues, most of them are small size, of course. We have almost 1 million annual audience. Now it's a lot of people. It's almost 6,000 acts, and very easily we can see 6,000 acts for at least 15,000 artists who are involved in this circuit. And now, if we add technicians and the promoters, it's really a lot of people. And we also collect some data on communication and on the reach of social media, and putting together Facebook and Instagram, we get to an annual reach of 15 million people. So we just ended up collecting this information, and now I think we are ready to start to explain why we are important, and I think this would be crucial to help cultural policies, and of course that's why it's extremely useful the work you're doing, and we have to do it here also. But at the same time, it's been helping the networking between venues. Of course, we are closer because of the crisis, but we are closer because we are sharing information, we are sharing data, we are sharing our problems. And I also believe it's going to be crucial to help our promotion, protection, and extremely important to make a point on what we do. That's about it. I would just like to bring to this conversation some data and some approach of what we are doing in Portugal. Thanks a lot.
Great, thanks, Gonçalo.